So next up is a really important session all about ethical business. And I think, if you look at the last century at a simplistic level, NGOs and charities had amazing intentions, but not always great execution. And business had great execution and not always great intentions. And I think one of the exciting things that's going on in the world today, and Paul Polman's speech yesterday was very much about this, is I think we're starting to see the emergence of some leaders at the top of big global businesses who are really focused on showing that actually business can be a force for good. And particularly in a world where the kind of political model has almost broken down, because as people have gone global, as business has gone global, as the world's financial systems, we've very clearly seen, are global, the political system has remained local. And I think within that, business has an amazing opportunity and almost an obligation to step up. So let's give you a little bit of background about how this session came about. It's been led out of the UK, and I think what's great about it, it's a really good example of how One Young World can actually get different people and different companies collaborating. So a team of 10 UK-based ambassadors from a range of companies. We have Barclays, we have Coutts, Aviva, PwC, Telefonica, have worked very closely with returning One Young World Councillor Antony Jenkins. And I just think, I want to call Antony out, who is now the new global CEO of Barclays, who is somebody that, over and above coming from a wonderful part of the world, because he was born about 8 miles away from where I was born, he's somebody who really is on a mission to show the world that banking can be a force for good. Not only can business be a force for good, but that banking can be a force for good. And the world needs banks. It just needs banks to behave in the right way. And I'm incredibly excited about what Antony can do, not just for Barclays, for Britain, but also for banking. Probably a measure of the person that he is that in the middle of all of this hectic activity that was kicking around at the time, and whilst he was being named the new global CEO, he went out of his way to still meet and convene the ambassadors. He did 3 separate sessions of over 2 hours each as the driving force behind this and putting it all together. And to do that at a time when there was so much other things going on in his life, I think it says a huge amount about who Antony is. So I'd like to give him a huge welcome and applause for that. Now, 2 amazing delegate ambassadors to my left, who are going to actually introduce the session, are Lawrence Gaston from Barclays and Charlotte Murray from Aviva. Lawrence did a wonderful job on your behalf. We had the Duke of York, the Queen's son, who hosted a One Young World send-off for the UK ambassadors at St James's Palace, and Lawrence spoke on your behalf incredibly eloquently that evening. And then you'll see Charlotte tomorrow, when she popped in to see the British Prime Minister David Cameron to ask him a few questions. So you'll be hearing more from her tomorrow. But I'm going to hand over to them to introduce the session. Before we do that, let's just have a look at a little video to give it some background, and then over to you guys. So if we can roll the video, please.
Violence spread through London last week like wildfire as rioters
and still chanting. Protesters,
police, the intelligence services and industry.
I am not against corporations as an idea necessarily. I'm against corporate power and influence in Washington and this kind of undue balance of power.
I don't really have any trust in the banks at the moment, no. I don't think big businesses look out for everyone. I think they're missing out the young people, the students, the people that are just starting off in life, trying to get a job after school. I think we're pretty much ignored.
Big business is all about greed. It's not balanced. It's just getting rich. And I think that's so unfair.
In terms of big businesses, I seem to remember them saying they want to create more jobs for people. But all I really think about when I think of big businesses and graduate employment is high turnover. All you hear about is bonuses. And it's not a personal thing, they obviously work hard, but then I just think, well, what are all these bonuses doing flying around when we've got Lord knows how many millions and billions of debt, as we saw from the London riots and Occupy London. People were, especially young people, were upset at things and took a stand.
By the time we got here about 4 in the morning, it honestly looked like a bomb had hit. Every piece of glass in the shop was smashed. The fronts of the shutters were on the, ripped off. There was blood in here where people had cut themselves.
Everyone was just on a riot, going mad, chucking things, chucking bottles, breaking into shops. It's the rich people, the people who've got businesses. We're just showing the rich people we can do what we want.
There are a lot of kids and a lot of people with very little money who could do something business-wise if they wanted to. Maybe it needs someone else to give them a break.
I think young people's disenfranchisement with big business comes from the behavior of big business over the last decade. The financial industry in particular has behaved largely disgracefully. And I don't think it's merely confined to young people. Even us middle-aged folk aren't particularly pleased. Large businesses have multiple stakeholders in the world. I think that we all owe a duty to the next generation, especially to the degree that we have not necessarily left things in right working order right now. If businesses want to re-engage the trust of younger generations, they're going to have to be directly more trustworthy and do good and do well. It is solely within the province of business to affect large-scale social change. I actually think that it's the funding mechanism for revolutions and for change for good.
Big companies, banks, governments, they're all, they're all responsible for it, for the world, for people, for money.
The people at the top are the ones that should take the most control and do what is right more for society than opposed to do what's right for themselves.
There is quite a distribution of activity under the heading of business, and not all of it is very appealing to young people right now. Because on the one hand you have large businesses behaving badly, and on the other hand you have the absolutely most important activity that we as people do, and that's to pull ourselves up through the creation of new goods and services.
With proper structure, corporations are a worthwhile thing. I think the degree of productivity and efficiency they can generate is not something that we can deny as we move forward technologically as fast as possible.
Without the banking system, also the world wouldn't function properly.
Many of them feel very free to not accept normal jobs, but they want to still be involved in commerce. I think one of the places it intersects is at social enterprises, where people are using business to affect social change and using social enterprise to change the world.
Okay, so we have just seen there, and we have heard from all of you throughout the summit, that trust in big business has broken down. And really, is it any wonder when in the last few years we have had LIBOR fixing, we've had phone hacking, we've had the Gulf of Mexico oil spill, we've had illegal drug marketing, and those are just a few of the many, many examples where big business, their actions, their policies and their responses have fallen short of our expectations. It really is clear to us that all too often unethical choices are being made within businesses. And of course, the perception amongst young people like us and older people is that these global companies are failing to act with values and integrity, with the same values and integrity that their mission statements and their code of ethics makes clear that they hold dear. Now, if you look at the examples we've just talked about and we've seen in the video, what's clear is that individuals and companies have compromised ethical values and their ethical behaviour in the pursuit of short-term financial return. And this unethical behaviour, it doesn't just harm all of us here and those out in the communities in which these businesses work, but it really does impact the businesses themselves. It damages companies' reputation and in the long term can have a huge impact on shareholder value. But what do we understand by ethical business? This is what we're here today to discuss. Well, ethics really are about the morals by which we live our lives. Every one of us in this room has a set of values that we use as tools to help us to make decisions. And we believe that companies should not act any differently. They should live by these set of values. This short-term thinking that we have seen from businesses has made a huge impact, and we believe that they need to exist for something far beyond these short-term financial targets. And the reason they need to do this is because they don't operate in isolation. They have an impact on the people and the environments around them. And of course, we are all impacted by businesses. We are communities, we are employees, we are consumers of the companies around us. And so we are their stakeholders. Okay, so we want to get you up and moving because you've probably been sitting down for a while now. So I want to ask you to stand up if you as a stakeholder believe that big businesses in your countries, in your communities, should listen to you as a stakeholder. Okay, so I think that's most of you. Now I want you to stay standing if you believe that currently, in today's world, these big businesses that are in your communities, in your countries, are listening to you, are taking into consideration your views. Okay, a few of you. I'd like to hear some examples, but I don't think we're going to go for the Jamie Oliver style roving mic. I'm going to hand over to Lawrence.
So we share, having worked as a group of ambassadors, we very much came to the same conclusions, I think, as you've just demonstrated. So over the last 6 months, we've been working together with One Young World Councillor Antony Jenkins on addressing this issue. And really, we've developed what we'd like to term as a One Young World proposal on how to drive forward ethical business. And we really think this comes in 3 stages of what we think companies should adopt. Firstly, and most importantly, is businesses need to understand their purpose. What is it they do? What do they stand for? And this doesn't substitute a financial purpose. This has to go beyond it. You know, what is it the company is really about? What is their long-term objective? And secondly, that purpose needs to be communicated and put into practice. Internally, that means employees have to know what it is they stand for. What is the culture of the organisation and what's expected of them? Externally, you know, what does it mean to us? How does that message get communicated to us so that we understand, as stakeholders, what it is that the companies that surround us really stand for? And finally, and most importantly, and this is something that we've seen brought up throughout sort of the last couple of days, is businesses must hold themselves accountable. They need to hold themselves accountable to the statements they make. If you say this is your purpose, hold yourself accountable to it. Be transparent when you fall short. Show the failings you've made, and it makes it a lot easier to understand. And secondly, hold yourselves accountable to us, your stakeholders, because we're impacted by what companies do, and we want to be a part of the conversation with them. And so this is basically our One Young World proposal, the framework that we believe will drive forward more ethical businesses. We want businesses to implement this initiative, and it really does all begin with them understanding their purpose. So today, what we've done is we've actually invited a panel to join us today. The panel's made up of industry leaders. Just want to briefly introduce them. We've got Niel Golightly from Shell, who's currently heads up in Shell Communications and has got a huge amount of experience in stakeholder engagement. We've got Sabine Zindera, who we've heard a lot this week about the sort of anti-corruption initiatives at Siemens, and Sabine is head of this initiative. We've also got Doug Richard, who, as I think you've seen from the tape, is a huge advocate in this space and is a real key voice in this issue. And finally, we've got Will Hutton, who's an academic, economist, author, commentator, and a true expert on how we drive forward ethical behaviour and organisational issues. So I now have the pleasure of introducing you. You've already heard from him, but One Young World Councillor and Barclays Group CEO Antony Jenkins, who I'm so grateful has helped us so much over the last 6 months and has very kindly agreed to facilitate today's session. So can I please ask you just to welcome Antony Jenkins.
Good morning, One Young World. All right then. So there is a very powerful thing about One Young World, but I wasn't aware of quite how powerful it is as an influence on people's lives. Last year, I stood before the One Young World audience and shared my views about how concerned I was with the problems in the world, most of which are very complex long-term problems. And I talked about how institutions are geared to short-termism, particularly in business, and how business had to focus on both the long and the short term and meet all of our stakeholders' needs. And I spoke about that about this time last year. On June 28th, Barclays announced that it had been fined for its involvement in the LIBOR situation. 4 days later, our chairman resigned, and immediately after that, our chief operating officer and our group chief executive also resigned. So the sort of visible, tangible example of what happens when a business does not serve all of its stakeholders became very personal for me. And then 2 months later, I was asked to lead Barclays as the group chief executive. So now I actually have to put my words into action, and you can hold me accountable for that. So it's been a wonderful experience working with the ambassadors, and they really have operated as they should do. And I think we as councillors have also operated as we should do, which is to provide advice, input, context, perspective, so that the ambassadors and you as delegates can form your own view. So in the course of this session, we'd love you to tweet in any comments, questions that you have. As you tweet them in, we'll try and pick them up as we go along. We have an esteemed panel in front of us, so I'm going to go ahead and start the session. And I'm going to start with Sabine. I'm going to ask you, Sabine, we heard a lot about the lack of trust in business, and Siemens in particular has been involved in corruption in the past and has spent a lot of time addressing those issues. So talk to me a little bit about why addressing these issues is important and how it relates to this question of lack of trust in business.
Well, thank you so much. It's a great honor to be here. I have come from Munich in Germany to be with you today. And first of all, congratulations. I have been to so many conferences, and sometimes you feel really exhausted after the second conference day, but not here. Yeah? I feel completely inspired, talking with you, sharing views, sharing experiences. Siemens has come a long, long way, and as you may know, we had a big scandal some 6-7 years ago, a scandal which almost ruined our lives, which always costed us the license to operate. And Siemens is a company, we have some 400,000 employees in 190 countries. We do everything from a power plant up to a light bulb. And the scandal, the corruption scandal we were involved in was epidemic, which means it was not a single thing, a single misconduct, it was an epidemic misconduct. And at the end, after investigations and so on, it costed us 2 billion euros in fines. We paid to the Department of Justice here in the US, we paid to the SEC, we paid to the German authorities and so on. But on top of that, of course, we had a huge loss in reputation. And it is so quick to destroy trust and reputation, and it takes years to rebuild that trust. And this is why we have started some years ago, and I've been with Siemens for 29 years now. We have started an activity which is called collective action, building alliances against corruption in cooperation with shareholders and stakeholders and international communities such as the UN Global Compact or in this International Chamber of Commerces or Transparency International. Because, and why? Because the issue of corruption is so big that it cannot be solved by one party alone. We need ally partners. And this is my message to you, the young generation. Join into this fight against corruption, because if we don't fight it, we will not see freedom, we will not see reduction of poverty, and we will not see prosperous markets. And if we want the world to become a better place, we need better economic situations for all of us.
Absolutely. And it's And how long has it taken to rebuild? This is something that I'm personally interested in, as you can imagine. But how long for Siemens has it taken for you to kind of claw your way back?
Look, this is still an ongoing process, and for me it was a true personal thing. As I said, I'm with Siemens now for 29 years, and when the scandal hit, I was always proud. I worked in purchasing in California. I created joint ventures in India and China. I was founder of a venture capital unit at Siemens. I was always proud. And when the scandal hit, nobody wanted to talk to me anymore. It was like I had a stigma here. And it was, oh, she's from Siemens. I can't have a cup of coffee with her. And rebuilding that trust, you can only do it by showing action. And we were sort of lucky that we got a budget of $100 million, which is based on the settlement which was achieved between the World Bank and Siemens. We had some wrongdoings also in that field, and as part of that settlement, we committed to invest $100 million into the fight against corruption. And today, after a selection process and due diligence process and global call for proposals, we run some 30 projects in 22 countries. And through doing that, really working on the ground with stakeholders, with organizations, we help, or we try to help to really change markets. But so it is at the end walking the talk. But it is not a sprint, it is a marathon, and of course we are desperate in between because things go slow, and if the political will in certain countries is not there, you have to walk, but never give up. That's the message.
Absolutely. Great. Okay, now let's turn to Will Hutton. Will, you're a very astute observer of the political sphere, the business sphere, the economy globally. How damaging is it for society at large to have lack of trust in business? What are the consequences of that for society at large?
Well, I think it's it couldn't be more damaging. I think that the kind of lesson of the 20th century is that we know that kind of command economy socialism doesn't work. And it's very vital that capitalism does work. So to find ourselves in 2012 at a gathering like this, where so many people stood up and said that their company, that they don't trust their companies, and couldn't be more important that is where the relationship between so many citizens and companies has got to. I think that we've lived through a kind of 25-year period that culminated in 2008. It was a kind of collective global mistake almost. We allowed the financial system the global financial system to grow to a gargantuan scale, so that private debt is many times larger than world GDP. Financial transactions are 15, 20 times more than world GDP. And we allowed the idea of the company during this period to become corroded. It happened in the Anglo-Saxon countries most, but actually I think it affected Germany too. This notion that the purpose of a company was actually to do nothing else but maximize shareholder value, a very financial conception of the company. And actually collectively capitalism lost its ethical foundation. And the consequence is what we're living through. And I think the moment has come to, and I think quite right, by the way, this is now a moment in time. I think the time has come to really revisit and reinvent the foundation of what a company is, and actually around that to build systems that support that new conception of a company. And that company will be committed to purpose, and that will solve the problem, I think, of some of this kind of unethical behavior. So it's a very big moment.
What's the impact, do you think, on global GDP of lack of trust in business?
Well, we know in Britain and that had the financial crisis not happened, GDP next year would be about 14% higher than it currently is. It's not quite as severe for the United States. The figure is more like 7 or 8. Globally, probably world GDP is 10 to 12% below where it could have been had we not gone through this financial crisis. And I think more important, and this is really, I think that I'm a great believer in the great point about Western capitalism, global capitalism, is the best thing that we know to combine, to harness science and technology to generate wealth that delivers goods and service to satiate human wants. And actually, a lot of capitalism and a lot of business in the last 10 or 15 years has not had that as its focus. I think there's been a real weakening in the pace of innovation worldwide, whether it be addressing issues of health that you were talking about this morning, issues of climate change that you were talking about yesterday, resource use. We've not been as inventive as we could and should have been. There's been too much preoccupation in trying to make kind of money in the immediate 3 months and not actually over the next 5 to 10 years.
Now, Niel, let me talk about Shell. Let me talk about the oil and gas industry. One of the industries that has attracted a lot of criticism over the years, along with financial services and others. How does trust impact your business? How do you think about it at Shell, and how do you try and build through your actions and how you communicate those actions a sense of trust in the organization?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And there's so many different ways to come at that question, but I think what I'd like to do is start by springboarding the answer to that question off of what Will said. I think this whole question about what is the role of the corporation is at the heart of building that trust. And if you think about our industry, which we're starting to think of more in terms of an energy industry rather than just an oil and gas industry, and you start to look at the way society sort of organizes itself around solutions to big problems, I think companies like ours in an industry like ours, especially around something as vital as energy, are starting finally to embrace the possibility that really the role of a corporation in society is to help be a catalyst or a solver of big societal issues and problems. Climate change, poverty, 9 billion people living on the planet at the middle of this century, 9 billion people who, by the way, are going to need some form of energy to continue to live, to build economic growth, to have lifestyles that start to balance some of the inequalities in the world. And if a company like ours, which it's beginning to do, is starting to think in terms of our role and our purpose as being to provide that energy and to provide different sources of responsible energy for that growing humanity, then we begin, I think, to address the expectations of the society that enables us, and meeting those expectations is really fundamental to building that trust. It's a long road to begin to think differently about how you organize yourself, how you think about long-term strategy, how you move beyond that very near-term shareholder value proposition and start to think about a long-term stakeholder value proposition. You start to look at the bottom line as an enabler and capitalism as an enabler, as the tool that helps you bring solutions forward rather than as end in itself, then I think you start down that road of building trust. And I see other big companies, not just in our industry, but in other sectors that are doing very much the same thing.
Great. So we haven't had any tweets yet, so please do tweet some things in for us so we can pick them up as we go along. Let's move now to the 3 principles that the ambassadors laid out. The first one was about this notion of purpose. And let me turn to you, Doug, because you've been very active in the for-profit space and social enterprise. You're doing a lot of work with the British government right now on apprenticeships. How important is it for big companies to have purpose at their core? And what should that purpose be about? I mean, Milton Friedman famously said the business of business is business, really talking about the bottom line. So how important is purpose, and how important is that that purpose should be kind of broadly drawn as opposed to narrowly focused?
I think we can safely start with Milton Friedman was also famously wrong, right? I think it is absolutely absurd for us in 2012 to be sitting here and talking about businesses as though we were talking about a mid-Victorian corporation. It is actually quite disheartening on some level. I spent most of the last decade trying to encourage people to be entrepreneurial, to start businesses. Now, how can I, on the one hand, say to the world, start a business, if the shape of business when you grow up is deeply unethical? It is a deep conundrum, because entrepreneurship, the starting of businesses, is where most of the wealth that we rely upon to grow the world and make the world a better place comes from. All the new jobs, all the productivity, all the innovations flow out of that entrepreneurial process. So we have no choice but to solve that tension. And what I find very interesting is when someone starts a business or a social business, there's no distinction in my mind. They always have a purpose. They always want to create a new thing or a new service or solve a problem or fulfill a desire. And usually that lines up, and there's a moment at that beginning of a business to make a decision and say, we are not only going to do this, but we're going to do it in a certain way. We're going to walk a certain path. And so what I find puzzling is where that goes when the business gets large. I don't think businesses have to have a purpose. I think they need to not lose their purpose. And in not losing their purpose, we then can understand what it is the job of a large corporation has to do. They have to refine the purpose that helps society in the first instance. And so for those businesses that have lost that purpose, I would encourage them to go back and look inside themselves and say, what purpose do we have? And it should line up. If a business is in the business of, I'll make something up randomly, is in the business of processed foods, then having their CSR unit stand up and tell me that they support a series of organic initiatives is deeply at odds with the core purpose of the business. Whatever they do, whatever social purpose they adopt, it has to line up with the core belief of the business, or none of us have any reason to believe that they're telling the truth.
And you made a very interesting point there about people who start businesses. It seems to me you're saying that very few, maybe nobody starts a business because they want to make a lot of money, and they start because they have some sense of creating something that doesn't exist today, addressing some problem in the world and so on. That's very important, because if it's operative on a startup, then it should be operative on a bigger organization as well.
It is an incredibly small fraction of the people that I teach or run into or invest in or participate with who walk in my door and say, Doug, I want to do this to get rich. It is a fraction of a fraction. They walk in, they say, I have a wonderful idea, I can solve this problem, I can do this new thing. They are driven by a desire, almost irresistible desire, to have an impact on the world. It's the loss of that impact and loss of that desire that I sort of am sad, tired, and angry to see the loss of.
Actually, if you read Steve Jobs' biography, that's what he says. Bill Gates says that, they didn't start out to become the richest men on earth. They set out to kind of solve those problems and built their business around it. It's a fundamental point, I think.
Sabine, so you talked about some of the problems that Siemens had been through, and you made a point about its effect on the people that work there. So how important is purpose for the people who work in a big organization? Not the senior leadership, the management, the executive, the board, but the people who actually work there. How important is it? How catalytic is it for big companies?
Yeah, well, we had rules and regulations in all of our business life. But what was really missing for some time was being authentic, and we had the strong tone from the top was missing, and also in many aspects, I guess, management was unfair in turning a blind eye to certain actions, because we had rules and regulations and we told our sales guys, look, go into country X and you do the deal. But then the manager was twinkling the eye or doing a little gesture indicating, haha, you know what I mean, how to do it. And if you do this, it is completely unfair vis-a-vis your team and vis-a-vis your employees. And the difference today is that we have crystal clear rules, but we walk the talk, and we have clear red lines. And once somebody steps over that red line, he or she will also face sanctions for misconduct. And that helps. Because you cannot have rules and regulations, but not impose actions on it.
And so purpose defines, of course, what an organisation will do and what it won't do and how it will do it. And in a sense, what you've talked about is what the way the organisation will operate. It won't operate in a way which is, endorsing, supporting, using corrupt practices. How does it work in the way that it informs what the organisation does, in the positive sense, so to speak?
You mean what do we do now?
As a purpose, as the purpose of the organisation.
Well, purpose, of course, of course we need to make money, because that is also the demand of shareholders that we have to fulfill. But on the other hand, we have come a long way in our company history with more than 150 years. And when I think back to the founder of the company, his mantra was, I will not sell the company's future for quick profits. And this is what we should believe in, I guess. Because quick profits may cost our lives.
Sorry,
back. The question I have that I have for you, Sabine, is I think you lead a very interesting challenge, because you're essentially the white hat inside of Siemens. Your title, your project is anti-corruption.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. And if you succeed, the sorry story is you get to zero. All you've accomplished is being legal. The minimum requirement to be a person in society is to be legal. We offer to corporations essentially the privilege of humanity. We give them legal standing in court. We limit their liability. We, even in the United States, give them the right to pour hundreds of millions of dollars into our presidential bloody campaigns. We give corporations a privilege of humanity, but we don't exact from corporations the price of being a person. If a person does something wrong, If a person does something wrong, we go to jail. If a corporation does something wrong, they pay a fine. A corporation is a person, it has those privileges, it has that the responsibility. The goal here today is not merely to be not corrupt. The goal is to have a higher purpose. And so the question I have is, when you're done making them not corrupt, how in heaven's name are you going to give them a purpose beyond making a profit?
Super question.
Thanks.
You know why? Because, as I said, in collective action, in fighting corruption collectively with others, we think that this is a great tool to develop markets. Because then other corporations can join in and do safe business in safe environments, and that will help nations to prosper.
Doug, I think your assumption is wrong. Actually.
Go ahead.
I think it's flat wrong, actually. Because I think corporations, we think of corporations as some sort of abstract entity, some sort of legal construct that has no face, has no soul, has no nothing, and it has all these attributes to it. The corporation I belong to and the one that I belonged to before both had roughly 80, 90,000 people in it. And those were 80 or 90,000 individual people. And each one of those individual people comes to work every day for a reason. And it's usually not for the reason of maximizing shareholder value. It's usually for the reason, aside from simply making a paycheck, it's usually for the reason of being part of something bigger, trying to do something that does have an impact. I agree completely with you that many of the entrepreneurs that come through your door, for example, are there to make an impact. And I think it's really fabulous that there are people that are doing that. Don't assume that people who are coming into work every day in a big corporation are not also trying to make a positive impact in some way, shape, or form. And I might, but I mean, yeah. And then I would also, just to close that out, I would also point out that actually there are a lot of big corporate leaders who have done absolutely the wrong thing, who didn't just pay a fine, they're actually in jail, and that's a good thing. And the judgments against wrongdoing in big corporations don't just come externally in forms of laws and prosecution. They also come internally from the internal culture of an organization that says, wait a second, this happened in my company, my leaders did this, that's totally unacceptable. This is not the company that I know, those people need to leave, and guess what, they're gone. I think you know that, Antony.
It can be quite radical here. I mean, look, from the company as a kind of legal construct, got invented in Holland and then Britain at the end of the 16th century. And for the next 300 years, you couldn't incorporate in Europe or the United States without having a declaration of business purpose. You know, you could only actually get the license to operate if you, from a public authority, if you said, this is my purpose. And actually, some of the companies that are now around, I mean, Unilever, for example, still has a purpose of trying to make the best everyday things for everyday folk. You know, and there's a lot of companies that have got ideologies like that almost at their core, which actually, if you scratch someone in Boeing, they will tell you that their business is to make the best planes that fly farthest, furthest, safest. And one of the founding documents of Boeing says that. And so, if you want this sense of people coming into work like that, they do it easier in companies that have that purpose, and it's still in the DNA of the company. And here's my proposal for One Young World. I mean, if you take this message seriously, why don't you insist that the companies for which you work not only have purpose, but declare it and incorporate in their articles of association? Why not go further and ask that corporate law in all our various countries requires incorporation to be associated with declarations of business purpose? I mean, that was, after all, what was done for many hundreds of years. And it would be quite, I think, big deal for you in One Young World to champion such an idea. So,
good. Now, we've had a tweet from Christy Dellinger, which says, how are we as stakeholders to hold you accountable to maintain ethical business practices as the leader of Barclays? A question obviously coming to me. I'm having difficulty seeing the tweets because there are lots of them, but I can only see this one tweet. But let me just pick up on this one, because right now at Barclays, I don't think you could say that we have an expressed purpose that operates across the organization. And coincidentally, I spent 2 days with my executive team this week on what is the purpose of Barclays. And thank you. Thank you. It's actually quite difficult when you sit down to try and answer that question of a financial institution that serves everybody from very low-income people in Africa all the way up to the United States Treasury. But it is, I think we're all agreeing, everybody here is agreeing that this is fundamental to how a company should operate. Will has said we should incorporate it into our articles of association. Doug has said that if a business fails in some way to operate legally, then there should be sanctions for that. So I think there's a high degree of agreement here. But let's move on to the question of how do we implement purpose? How do we make it part of the DNA of the organization? How do we get it into the culture? There's a tweet here from Hutton Hedinger which says, what is the best way to reconcile long-term goals for change with quarterly reporting? It goes back to this notion of how you drive purpose into your goal setting. So Niel, you were pretty passionate before on the fact that people come to work and want to do good things. So why don't we try and pick that one up as we go?
Yeah, I think there are a couple things here on this one. One is, and this is going to be a generational change, I think. One is, how do you account for externalities? Right? So we're very, very good at accounting for cost within a business. We know how to account for materials, we know how to account for manpower, we know how to account for capital, we know how to account for all of that. and the revenue and the profit coming through from that is also very easily countable. But take my business, for example. If you buy a liter of fuel, or in the United States, if you're buying a gallon of gasoline, the amount that you pay, some portion of that, probably around 20% or so, goes into taxes. Maybe 1 or 2 or 3% goes into the cost of marketing. A lot of it goes into the price of getting oil. What you don't have anywhere in the cost of that gallon of gasoline, and what's not captured in the quarterly reporting, is what is the impact on the environment? What is the impact on climate change? What is the impact on communities? These are all externalities that don't get captured in the financial reporting or the quarterly reporting process. One of the things over a long period of time, and I know many of the consultancies are beginning to look at this, is how do you begin to capture some of that? And I think once you start to really understand, and once we start to figure out how we manage our businesses based not just on the accountable costs, but also on the externalities, you might begin to move down this road to reconciling long-term goals with quarterly reporting. Our industry, of course, it's a little bit easier to take the long-term view because much of what we invest in have 30, 40, 50-year lifespans. Whether it's a refinery, whether it's a gas field, whether it's a deep water drilling operation, those have long-term lifespans, and investors recognize that. But I think this whole question of what are we really, what costs are we incurring and what value are delivering, it needs to be broader and it needs to be expanded.
Good, thank you. So Doug, you've done a lot of work in the entrepreneurial space, but you've also run big businesses. How do you, in a big business context now, how do you get the purpose into the culture, into the DNA of the organization? How do you make it operative on all the decisions that people take day in and day out, when perhaps the senior management is not overseeing every single action? How does that work?
Well, you and I both know senior management cannot oversee every single activity. Exactly. We oversee a small fraction of of activity. And in fact, I frequently found running larger businesses that they were running me. And in fact, that I wasn't steering the ship so much as along for a ride. And I think that it's that sense of helplessness at the top that drives part of the challenge that we face. And so I guess I'd answer the question in two ways. One, I think no matter how large a business, it can be narrow-minded. It can be narrowly purposed. It can say, we are going to make a change. But I think as leaders of businesses, you in particular, given the sheer dimension of the business, you're going to find yourself having to make sure that everyone asks the same question over and over and over again, attached to every decision. Whatever question that is, you're only going to be able to afford 1, 2, 3. It is almost a monomaniacal single-mindedness that drives communication to the furthest reaches of a business. So I do think on some level it can start from the top. I'm just quite conscious that it can only go so far from the top. And I think that it's this entire audience that shares that responsibility. Niel commented that he thought I was wrong. I'm frequently wrong. I'm just never without an opinion. And I don't actually think that we disagreed. You're right. Most of the people in this room work inside of businesses. We have jobs. We have day jobs. And the fact of the matter is, you don't walk into a business or a business you work in thinking, I'm going to be corrupt. Most people have just the opposite view. But they also don't walk into the business empowered. And I think that the challenge I would put in front of everyone here is to remember that the balance is changing profoundly. We are in 2012. Twitter has happened. You become brand assassins every day you wake up. And you are complicit in the activity of those who do wrong to the degree you stay silent. Therefore, if you don't complain, if you are not unreasonable, if you don't tweet, if you don't use the huge power of the internet to amplify your voice, to be unreasonable on a daily basis, then you are a part of the problem. Full stop.
Doug, it's an interesting point you make. Typically, at Barclays, we have about 200 tweets a day. In my office, I have a screen that tracks all the tweets about Barclays. And generally, the tweets are things like, I'm in a branch in Barclays paying a check or something. The day after the LIBOR scandal broke, we had 10,000 tweets. and the screen on my computer was scrolling so quickly that I couldn't actually read the comments that were being made, and it was scrolling faster than that, actually, than scrolling up there. Will, you've worked with a lot of big businesses, you've worked in government, you've tackled difficult questions like how much should we pay senior civil servants, that type of thing. How can big organizations communicate purpose and drill it into the DNA? You've talked about putting it in the Articles of Association, but that's a legal construct more than anything else. How do you engage people around this? And also, when you just touch on some of the work that you've done in the space of fairness, because I think that the purpose in some way has to acknowledge this notion of fairness.
Well, how do you do it? I think one of the reasons I argue that it should be in the Articles of Association, that you have to make directors can then say that part of their obligations as directors is the delivery of purpose, and that rather than just maximizing shareholder value, that's a big, big step. I think that shareholders, when they own a company, need to know that they're owning a company that has this purpose. And that again, there's a question about quarterly profits, quarterly reporting. The British government is actually approaching abolishing quarterly reporting and making it and relieving companies of that obligation, and just making reporting half yearly and yearly. But I mean, you want to report once you start saying that the legal obligation is delivery of purpose and profit, you can then start to open up a debate about what you're reporting along the lines you've described. So, the people who run an enterprise start to be measured by different metrics by their shareholders, because that's actually embedded in the way the place is run. If I wanted to really go all the way on this, I think I would want to have shareholders who are with a company for a longer period of time. I think should have more votes. And I also think that we should start, when we give shares to employees, so that, there's ESOPs in America, we're developing ideas like that all across, actually. I should imagine that most of the countries represented in this room, there'll be some incentives to have employee or employee share ownership. That makes much more sense if an employee owns a share, knowing that not just there's going to be a dividend, but actually they are going to have votes associated with that share, which are also going to be about holding their managers to account for the delivery of purpose. So the Germans have supervisory boards. You do it that way. You could have, I chair EDF Energy, is a French company. It operates a big energy operation in Britain. I chair something called the EDF Stakeholder Advisory Panel. And what we do is we try and hold the management team of EDF Energy to account. And we've had some success. It is the lowest of it has the lowest tariffs of the 6 energy companies in the UK. It has at the end of a year for vulnerable customers, it will rebate if they're on the wrong tariff. It will just automatically put them onto the right tariff, the cheapest tariff, and rebate them the excess money they've paid. These are kinds of things that we're trying to do, holding the management team to account for delivery of what they declare their purpose to be, which is to be a great energy company. So, you need to have some governance in there. You want your employees to be empowered with some shares. You want your directors to be, to have legal obligations that deliver purpose. And you will start to hardwire it into companies' DNA. But it's a big agenda, big agenda. Sabine.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on that interesting insight. When the corruption scandal hit Siemens, it had basically no impact on our stock. So the course, how do you say, yeah, the stock markets reacted for 1 or 2 days, yes, and then they went back to normal. Yes. And I don't know how that was in your case, for example, but many companies that are subject to scandals, this is not reflected at the stock exchange.
Yes. I think our experience was slightly different in the sense that it also created a leadership vacuum for us, which did affect the stock price. Once that was resolved, the stock came back. So I think, to some extent, but to build on Will's point, the market doesn't hold businesses accountable for these sort of infractions necessarily, because stock markets operate on the principle of the net present value of future profits, and as long as they feel that whatever the sanction is can be dealt with over the long term, they tend to be less concerned about that. Now, that's not a statement of whether that's right or wrong, but it is just how it tends to operate.
Yeah. But there's also an interesting development that many pension funds now that are big investors, for example, in our company, they request detailed information on how we do in sustainability, in anti-corruption, and this really helps also to, you know, keep on the movement, the motivation.
Anthony, one thing that's fascinating, I mean, this conversation has been quite rightly and understandably much about flagrant wrongdoing in the corporate environment, and it's an important problem, and it's one that needs to be addressed in any number of ways. What's almost as interesting, though, are matters of meeting expectations that fall short of flagrant wrongdoing. In other words, understandings and assessments of what's a right approach to a challenge and what is the approach that's really expected by society. What I mean by that is we've consciously within Shell started to shift our approach to taking on environmental and community and social challenges from what we used to call a decide, do, and defend model, DDD. And now we use a dialogue, act, and deliver model. And what that means is it used to be that we thought we were pretty smart. We thought we had really good scientists. We thought we had really good engineers, and we do. And if you take a problem, for example, Brent Spar, many of you may have heard about the Brent Spar episode that was about 10 years ago or so, where there was we had to get rid of an oil platform in the North Sea. And all of our engineers got together, and the environmental engineers, and they said the most environmentally responsible way to do this is actually to fill it up with water and sink it to the bottom of the North Sea. All the studies, all the science said that was the right way to do it, to have the minimum impact on the environment. So we decided we were going to do that. We made that decision, we started to act, and then we had to immediately start to defend it, because that wasn't what the expectation of society was. Society looked at that and said, wait a second, that doesn't sound right. Why are you dropping your litter in the bottom of the North Sea? What that taught us is it's really about beginning with dialogue, really understanding what the expectations are first, and then accommodating and incorporating those expectations into the decision we make, and then delivering on the commitment that we make on the back of that.
I thought I just want to pick up this point about, because you asked about fairness, and it really, when you were talking, I was really kind of really triggered some reflections on this. I mean, you know, a lot of people, when you talk about having a fair capitalism, they say, fairness? What does fairness mean? You know, it's in the eye of the beholder, or it's apple pie and motherhood. And I think we know enough now from behavioral psychology and about the construction of the human psyche to know that actually fairness is a really kind of embedded disposition in every single one of you. You know, when we know that human beings from a very early age formulate an intent, and there's a consequence in the world from the formulation of the intent, and if it's a good consequence, they expect a proportional reward, and if it's a bad consequence, they recognize that there's a tariff and they should get some proportional punishment. Justice in every single one of your countries is measured by a pair of scales. So there's a tariff, so that the worse the punishment, the worse the crime, the greater the tariff of punishment. And it's the same thing with reward. And when I think about contemporary companies, and one of the reasons why there's some collapse of trust in contemporary companies, is actually this disposition to fairness in the conduct of companies, whether it's dumping stuff in the North Sea, whether it's the way people are paid, whether it's the way they formulate strategies, the way they relate to their customers, kind of mis-selling them things, whether it be in banking or in the pharmaceuticals, is seen to be unfair, is seen to be disproportionate. And actually, we've got to get back to a world of proportionality, a world of fairness. So part of this business about purpose is relating the way we do business to fairness. Really important.
Yeah, I agree with that. Now, I'm going to turn to the tweets because some people have been tweeting, can you please answer our tweets? It's the sort of second derivative of tweeting.
But that's the answer the Libya question.
That's so good.
It's come up 1,000 times, the Libya question.
So let's have a look. Please answer our questions, please answer. Okay, here's a good one. Isn't capitalism by its very nature selfish? What do we think?
Yes.
You're a capitalist. Are you selfish?
Of course.
And is that a bad thing?
No. So I think we need to get over simple-minded rhetoric about capitalism. Capitalism is a single word that covers a multitude of activities. I think that we forget sometimes as people that the most powerful driver of humanity is self-interest, and that there is nothing wrong with that. People start businesses. They start them because they want to be loved. They start them because they want to feel accomplishment. They start them because they think they can change the world. They start them because they're arrogant and they just know better, and sometimes they're right. The motivation of the individual, whatever drives an individual, is fine from my point of view, so long as it's expressed in a way that we are comfortable with. It is the collective self-interest of 10,000, 100,000, 1 million entrepreneurs that in fact has pulled us up in society and has created the wealth and the problems that we enjoy and deal with. And thus I think it is ridiculous to indict all entrepreneurship and all business and all capitalism because of the challenges that we face as people in this dialectic between the individual, who is very small, and the corporation, which is very, very large. So no, there's nothing wrong with capitalism, and yes, it's quite self-interested.
Yeah. And then a good question to follow on from that, a tweet up here about regulation. Is regulation good or bad? Do we need regulation to temper the animal spirits of capitalism? Niel, you're in a highly regulated industry, as am I. What's your perspective on that?
Good regulation is good and necessary. Bad regulation can be a problem, but regulation is something that absolutely is necessary for a number of different things. One is to make sure that we're all operating on a level playing field, whether it's in my industry or in yours. Good regulation helps to, in fact, begin to capture some of those external costs of the businesses that we do. Good regulation helps to provide for the guide rails, and they're nothing more than guide rails, by the way, guide rails for how we should do business in a responsible fashion. I say, by the way, that they're only guide rails because I think this whole question of compliance versus principles is something that we haven't really touched on very much. Compliance, absolutely necessary. That's sort of at that level of of breaking the rules. Principles being something that's even more important to how a business does business, which is to look at what that purpose is and to strive for achieving that purpose.
There was sorry, go ahead.
I'm just going to say, if you think of sport, I mean, you wouldn't dream of tennis or football, American football, any of these sports being played without rules. And you're constantly thinking about, are the rules designed to produce competitive outcomes? I mean, American football is organized in an incredible way to ensure that, every season that the teams, as far as possible, start with a level playing field to make it one of the most competitive and exciting spectacles, in the world, actually. It's not like kind of British football where there's only 4 teams ever have a chance of winning the Premiership. I think actually, how you design markets is a read across from how we think about designing rules in sport. You wouldn't dream of not doing it in sport. You wouldn't dream, I don't think, of not doing it in markets.
And I have a strong bias on this particular topic because my own view is that although we have laws and we have regulation, that is no substitute at all for the behavior that is required of large organizations in the commercial space. Large organizations have to take responsibility for their own behaviors and actions. And I actually believe that businesses that operate in an ethical way will ultimately be more successful. We've talked a lot about shareholders here, but there's a fundamental difference in my view between short-term profits and shareholder value. Shareholder value comes from the sustainability of the enterprise in its broadest terms. So it has to start with well-run, ethical organizations that have at its core a sense of purpose, a sense of values that the organization itself holds itself accountable for. Of course you need laws, of course you need regulation to protect against circumstances in which corporations err, but in my view it has to start with the company. And I also think it's an excellent point that all of us, but in particular you, should hold companies accountable for operating within their stated purpose and operating ethically.
Yeah. And if I may comment, clean business must be good business. And looking into our business figures, I'm happy to report that we had the best business figures after the scandal.
Yeah.
Because we also took the opportunity to look into our company and to restructure processes. And we exchanged people and old networks, which was useful.
And we've had some tweets, Sabine, about, and this is a very good question, quite a profound one actually. Do you think Siemens would have changed without the, and you know, people could ask me the same question about Barclays. Would Barclays change without the LIBOR scandal, or would Siemens change without the corruption scandal? Do you need to have these near-death experiences to almost wake up big companies?
It was definitely a super wake-up call for the company. And just to remember, I mean, today there's only one member of the board still on the board. All other members of the board have been exchanged, and also many other managers. And we have completely restructured the company. And that definitely would not have happened without the scandal. Just some little organic changes, but not in that sense.
Good. Let's move on now. Let's talk about how you can take this notion of purpose and really drill it down and hold big companies accountable. We've already discussed, you know, you can vote with your feet and take your business elsewhere. Investors have a role to play, the media, social media. But what sorts of things can we as individuals, what sort of things can society do to actually hold businesses accountable for operating against their purpose? Doug?
I think the answer has to be to reflect as many facets as there are stakeholders to a business. The fact is, you and I sit here and we're quite conscious of the fact that we don't measure the success of our businesses on one measure. People may think one does, but we don't. And what I find very interesting is the best business leaders never do. The best business leaders know that an educated workforce is a better workforce, so you educate your workforce. That customers that are rich make for richer customers. You'd think this was rocket science, and you end up with better customers. If you invest in your supply chain, you end up with a more resilient supply chain being the small businesses upon whom your success rests. These are stakeholders. You invest in them out of a more enlightened sense of self-interest, because it's good business. And yet you find, I know all of the people on this panel are deeply aware of the fact that we have many business leaders that don't see this. They sacrifice the long-term prosperity of their businesses for short-term profits by shortchanging their own stakeholders and therefore limit their own long-term success. Thus it becomes, back to Will's point, we need to find mechanisms to create an incentive for long-term views. Therefore, I think Will understates some of his more radical proposals. The notion that the longer you hold a share, the more the share is worth as a vote is a quite radical proposal. Because all of a sudden, I'm going to hang on to shares until I can vote the whole damn corporation. The fact of the matter is, that's a fascinating concept. It drives a change in performance. Somebody up here said, remember what Paul said, we need to redesign capitalism. I completely agree. And it's in our hands to make those design changes. And you start, I think, by holding people accountable, by holding companies accountable on a daily basis. You're not the only CEO who watches tweets. I think every CEO should watch tweets, and I think all of us should be tweeting to our heart's content, as apparently we are.
Now,
actually, it's quite.
Go ahead, Will.
Yes, I mean, I do think that. I just been seeing a tweet on the Occupy movement. I mean, and the film that came before. I mean, the times are changing. The times they are changing. For those with long memories, that's a Bob Dylan song.
Right.
But I mean, I mean, when Antony took over at Barclays, he referred to looking after his stakeholders in the short and long term. It was not what the previous incoming CEOs of Barclays have said for the previous 25 years. Elizabeth Murdoch, at a big speech she gave in Britain in September, said that business without purpose would risk the ethical basis of capitalism and even freedom itself. A Murdoch saying that. You've got this growing revolt on tax. Companies in my country, there's been a number of newspapers, not just the centre-left papers, but centre-right papers, have been saying companies should pay their tax. There's a big campaign to have on tax justice. That's another element of this. Consumers can use their buying power. They can withhold their purchases from companies they think are behaving unethically, and buy from those they think are behaving ethically. There's 1,300 of you at this conference. You're amongst the best in your respective countries and companies. The kinds of companies that you want to work for and build a career in, and be proud of actually saying that those are the companies that you work for, are going to be the ones that behave in this way. There's a lot of change out there. Shareholder value is no longer seen as the be-all and end-all of what a company should do. Jack Welch just said it's stupid. And he was the guy who founded the movement back in the early 1980s. The times are changing. It's a moment in time to seize. Really, it is.
Right. Or at least you need a broader definition of shareholder value.
Yeah.
That's the point for me. Let's get a couple of views from Shell and Siemens. Now, how do you make your purpose operative inside the company? How do you get, the person on the front line in a manufacturing plant, on an oil rig? How do you get them to actually connect with the corporate purpose? Sabine first.
Yeah, well, it starts all with being authentic, I guess. Yeah, and the culture, the leading culture, needs to be authentic. They need to walk the talk every day, every single day, and that is important. But what really helped us after the scandal was that our incentive system was redesigned, and that managers, a certain part of our incentive system was also focused on collective action and on the actions we take. So this really helped to bring those activities to the hearts, but also to the money box of the managers, and that really helped to support the worldwide rollout.
So having baited Doug a little bit earlier on, I'm going to say I completely agree with what Doug was saying just now around kind of understanding what the problem is that we're trying to solve. So within Shell, for example, for many, many years, we were really an asset-driven company. What that means is we were thinking in terms of oil rigs, gas drilling operations, refineries, and so forth, and thinking, okay, how do we maximize these things, right? And you develop oil, you produce oil in one place, and you turn it into something that's usable, and then the customer's kind of way down the road a little bit, and oh yeah, there are societal impacts and environmental impacts. We probably need to manage those. Our CEO has been very explicit about saying, no, we need to turn that entire equation around. We need to start with what is the customer, what is the stakeholder, what is the community, what is society expecting? What does it need from us? What is the problem that we're trying to solve? And then work backwards from there. What does that mean in terms of the kind of energy and the way we produce that energy and the business models that we use in order to deliver that energy? And it makes all the way through the organization for a much, much different way of tackling everyday problems and everyday tasks within a company like ours.
Doug, do you want to say something?
Well, it seems to me, given the fact that Niel speaks as part of the voice of what Shell is thinking today, then we need to take a message from it. If companies are going to do what we expect of them, if they're going to live up to expectations, then we have an obligation to expect more. Full stop. We can't just stop at our current expectations. We can't stop at saying don't be corrupt. If companies are going to become more and more sensitive to the expectation of consumers and affiliates and stakeholders and just people in the public who have a voice, then it is our job to continue to expect more. The bar has to continue to rise. And even though you see more and more evidence of corruption exposed, bear in mind 100 years ago, you would have seen no evidence at all. So things are moving in the right direction, and it's going to be a very bumpy road to get there.
So that's a good point to end on. Let me just make a couple of comments before I close this section of the session. And I just want to talk very specifically about Barclays. We've heard from Shell and Siemens. So I am in the process of crafting a purpose for the Barclays Group. Next week, we are going to spend time at Barclays looking at what our core values are and defining a balanced scorecard for the institution. What that's really about is setting goals, targets, metrics for each of our stakeholders, for our shareholders, for our customers and clients, for our colleagues, and for broader society. We will do all of that work and get that done by the end of the year. What I would love to do personally is if One Young World will have me back in a year's time, I'll come and give you an update. Okay.
My pleasure.
I'll give you an update on how we're doing. I do know that changing large organizations is difficult. I've spent most of my career doing it, but I am personally deeply committed to making this change at Barclays. With that, please thank the panelists. I think they've been brilliant.